Good. May I start?
Yes.
Good morning and welcome. I'm Ambassador Ronald Newman, the president of the American Academy of Diplomacy, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to the 2021 Ambassadors Forum, which is presented in coordination with the University of Virginia and with the Robert Center for Jefferson Studies at Monticello. Unfortunately, we are again online and virtual rather than in person, as we would have preferred in those in that beautiful setting on top of Mount Alto. But I think we can promise you a good program nonetheless. We have had this partnership with the Jefferson Center and the American Academy of Diplomacy for some years, and I think it has been a great success. For those of you who don't know us, the American Academy of Diplomacy is a small organization of former senior diplomats, all in retirement, and it has two primary functions. One is to talk to Americans about the importance and value of diplomacy, and the other is to talk to the State Department about things we think they might do better. I will note in a brief moment of commercial interruption that among the things we do day in and day out during the year to talk to Americans about the reality of diplomacy is to produce two podcasts, one called American Diplomat and the other called The General and the Ambassador, slightly different themes, and both of them quite fascinating. If you're interested in podcasts, if you just hit our website, American Academy of Diplomacy, you can find links to both of them. I will be talking a little later about, in more detail, about the theme of this program of diplomacy and democracy and news, propaganda. But I think it's sufficient to say that we are all part of the news world, 24-hour cycles, and that this has a great deal of influence on our foreign policy and on the conduct of diplomacy. We'll talk about that more later, but our initial speaker will give us a sense of how this is not quite as new as we might think. Well, with those brief words of introduction, I would like to pass to Damon Irby, who is the Director of Global Initiatives at the University of Virginia Center for Politics and head of the center's Global Perspectives on Democracy initiative. And they are a co-sponsor and organizer of today's event. So, Damon, it's over to you.
Well, thank you so much, Ambassador Newman. The University of Virginia Center for Politics was founded in 1998 by Professor Larry Sabato to overcome the notion that politics thwarts the proper function of government. We think politics makes public policy more vibrant and makes bureaucracies more responsive. Since our inception, we've established annual conferences, publications, programs, and curricula to advance democracy around the world and to equip people to better understand politics and government. International programming at the Center for Politics began in August 2006 with the hosting of the International Youth Democracy Summit and the establishment of the Center's Global Perspectives on Democracy program. Since that time, Global Perspectives has directly engaged thousands of people and fostered citizen-citizen dialogue between the United States and nations around the globe. We host leadership and civic engagement related exchanges, usually funded by the US Department of State, that include participants of all ages, from high school student leaders to high-level government officials. Global Perspectives on Democracy also has become known for our Ambassador Series that was established in 2014 when we hosted then the Russian Federation's ambassador, Sergei Kislyak. We've hosted dozens of ambassadors since the program's founding. And this past week, as a part of the University of Virginia's Global Week, we hosted the ambassadors of Egypt and the former ambassador of Afghanistan. We also host and partner on events such as today's News, Propaganda, and Diplomacy. We have placed special emphasis on the recruitment of UVA students for participation in this conference. As we know, learning from the panelists and speakers will open the students' eyes to knowledge and perspectives on the subject matter that I'm sure they have not previously considered. It's an honor once again to work with the American Academy of Diplomacy and the Robert H. Smith's International Center for Jefferson Studies at Monticello. And a special thank you to Andrew O'Shaughnessy, the Saunders Director of the International Center for Jefferson Studies, for his friendship and partnership over the years. And on that note, I will turn it over to Andrew O'Shaughnessy. Thank you so much, and we look forward to the day's proceedings. Thank you.
Damon, thank you very much indeed. We're thrilled to have your students with us, and hello and good morning to our audience. Thank you for joining us. My name's Andrew O'Shaughnessy. I'm the Saunders Director of the Robert H. Smith International Center for Jefferson Studies at Monticello, and it's my pleasure to be welcoming you to our 12th annual conference with the American Academy of Diplomacy on the topic News, Propaganda, and Diplomacy. The American Academy of Diplomacy exists to explain to the public the importance of diplomacy as a tool for national security. It is a bipartisan organization. Its members often disagree with one another over policy issues, but they are united in their desire to serve their country. Many of the members have served in some of the most prestigious and dangerous postings, and they also volunteer their time to speak at events such as today. This is a collaboration that we at Monticello value as part of our mission to promote a global dialogue through Jefferson. The International Center for Jefferson Studies hosts at least one foreign conference every year. Towards the end of next year, we're holding a comparative conference about independence leaders in St. Augustine, Trinidad, in association with the University of the West Indies and the Eric Williams Memorial Collection. Our conference today is usually held at Monticello with its magnificent views of the Blue Ridge Mountains. We regret that we are virtual this year for the second time, but hope next year to resume our regular venue. The audience is invited to engage in a Q&A following presentations by our panelists and the keynote address at the end of the conference. I shall be thanking various people who've helped in my closing remarks at the end of this morning. I'm now, though, delighted to be able to introduce our first speaker. It's become a tradition always to have someone, a historian who offers a historical perspective on the subject of the day. And this will be Tyson Reeder, an author and professor at the University of Virginia, where he's editor of the Papers of James Madison. He's also author of Smugglers, Pirates, and Patriots, Free Trade in the Age of Revolution, which was published by the University of Virginia Press in 2019. Please join me in welcoming Tyson Reeder.
Thank you, Andrew, for that. I just want to start my screen share here. Let's see. Okay. Am I up and running with my PowerPoint? Can I get an affirmative?
Yes, we see the PowerPoint.
Excellent, thank you. All right, well, thank you again, Andrew, and to everybody at Monticello and the International Center for Jefferson Studies and the American Academy of Diplomacy for inviting me to speak today. It's a pleasure to be back at this wonderful conference. If you were here last year, you may recall I gave a broad overview of early America's troubled history of the destructive symbiosis of foreign meddling, foreign collusion, and partisan politics that all culminated in the War of 1812. This year, I thought it would be helpful to zero in on the election of 1796. The election had pitted Thomas Jefferson and Republicans who sympathized with France against John Adams and his Federalists who wanted a closer relationship with Britain. And Britain and France were at war. You'll need to remember that, or a lot of this information will just be noise. So France versus Britain, Jefferson and Republicans, France, Adams and Federalists, Britain. Foreign influence is the angel of destruction to elective governments, John Adams told his compatriots in his inaugural address. More than a nonpartisan warning, the line was a partisan accusation. He had just won an election rife with charges of foreign meddling and foreign collusion. Now, to understand the origins of Adams's accusations, we can travel to this part of the country on the borders of the Western United States and Spanish-held Louisiana. So in this region, the White and Arkansas rivers flow into the Mississippi, and the two tributaries are connected by this channel of water. Now, obviously, topography changes over time, making it difficult to pinpoint where this exact channel may have been, but it likely lands us right in this region. And in fact, we may be looking at the remnants of that channel or some iteration of it. So if we can imagine this channel connecting all the way to the White River, it's easy to imagine the events that I'll describe here. So on a fall morning around early October 1796, Georges-Henri Victor Collot sighted a large dugout canoe gliding down the channel toward his wilderness camp along the Arkansas River. On a secret reconnaissance mission for the French government, the spy had been expecting this arrival, but something was wrong. In the distance, he could see only 2 men in the boat. There should have been 3. A couple of days earlier, Collot had sent his second-in-command, Joseph Vahon, who I'll just anglicize as Warren. Collot sent Warren and 2 guides to reconnoiter the White River. Collot would lead his remaining few men up the Arkansas, and the parties would reunite where the channel connects the 2 rivers. So Warren loaded his dugout canoe with supplies and the group separated before dawn. 12 hours later, Warren and his 2 men reached the channel that would lead them back to the Arkansas. The trio pitched camp for the night. One guide went hunting while the other collected wood. They would float the channel and rejoin Collot on the Arkansas the next day. So they thought. Alone by the canoe, Warren spotted 2 Chickasaw natives approaching. One carried a cassette, a deadly war club resembling a tomahawk. The visitors asked to trade food for rum. After some haggling, tempers flared, and one Chickasaw man jumped into the dugout to seize a barrel of rum. Warren sprang for his musket. The Chickasaw careened his cassette toward Warren's head. The Frenchman jerked back and caught a murderous blow to the chest. He slumped almost lifeless to the canoe floor. One guide saw the violence from a distance, snatched his musket and fired. The ball tore through the Chickasaw assailant's arm. The Chickasaws fled, leaving Warren near death in the canoe, undoubtedly with mangled internal organs and broken bones. 2 days later, about 9 o'clock in the morning, Cullot saw the two guides paddling toward his camp along the channel. As they came to shore, he discovered his companions sprawled at the bottom of the vessel, still fighting for breath and barely able to talk. One of the guides recounted the attack and swore that the Chickasaws were the same two men whom Cullot had seen periodically along his Mississippi journey, beginning 500 miles back in Illinois country. So the story afflicted Cullot. Was this something more than a fracas over rum? Had the attackers tracked the Frenchmen hundreds of miles down the Mississippi? Did the Chickasaw pair mistake Warren for him? He and Warren shared a similar build and dress after all. Did they want him dead? Or had somebody enlisted them to kill him? Somebody who knew about his secret mission? All of these questions ran through through Cullot's mind. You see, Cullot had traveled the Mississippi to gauge, in the Mississippi Valley, to gauge what kind of empire France could build in the West once it pried territory away from Spain and the United States. In fact, this first map that we saw that helped us locate Cullot's position on the Arkansas was one drawn by him. And he produced other maps and images, a lot of maps and images, to document the Ohio and Mississippi valleys. Layouts of forts, major roads, rivers, trade routes, towns, homes, people, troops, living conditions, geography, topography. He was a fine artist and an excellent cartographer, and he documented it all. French rulers hoped to strong-arm their weaker Spanish allies into ceding Louisiana to them. They might then strip the United States of southwestern territory and resurrect the vast North American empire they possessed just over 30 years prior. Since spring, Cullot had traveled the Ohio and Mississippi rivers, reconnoitering British, Spanish, and US strength in western valleys. The French minister in Philadelphia, Pierre-Auguste Adet, had recruited Cullot for the mission. Adet despised the recent Jay Treaty between the United States and Britain. To him and his superiors, the treaty terminated France's alliance with the United States. As Adet saw it, France had freed the United States during the Revolution, and in return, he expected Americans to keep the British at bay in North America. Instead, as far as he could see, the US government had sided with the enemy, and France would have to intervene. With Cullot, Adet developed a two-pronged strategy. First, prepare the West to fall into French hands. Second, as Cullot put it, try by every possible means to bring about Jefferson's election as president. Cullot would promote Jefferson's presidency as he conducted his espionage in the West, and Adet would work the Northeast. The coming election would be close. Everybody knew that. Jefferson and his Republicans could count on the South and West, but Federalist frontrunner Vice President John Adams would almost certainly carry the North and Northeast. The unpredictable state of Pennsylvania would cast the deciding votes, a swing state in modern parlance. Republicans might take the presidency if they won Pennsylvania, and they might win Pennsylvania if Adet didn't ruin it for them first. Adet calculated that men who are devoted to us would vault Jefferson into office if France encouraged them. In September 1796, he traveled to Boston to take the pulse of Jefferson's fellow Republicans there in the heart of Federalist territory. He found a dispirited lot, ready to abandon the upcoming election to their adversaries. In his own, likely admittedly exaggerated words, he raised their downtrodden courage, revived their hopes, and he extracted promises that they would act with energy to appoint Jefferson president and to discard John Adams. 1 week before Pennsylvanians selected their vital presidential electors, a day sprang a letter into a Philadelphia Republican newspaper, something akin to an open letter, for he addressed it to recently named Secretary of State Timothy Pickering, but he intended it for the public. France would seize US vessels that carried prohibited wartime goods to their British enemies, he announced. Perhaps, he thought, he could threaten Federalist merchants into Jefferson's column with lost trade. While presidential electors were still pondering and deliberating their final choices, a day threw 2 more letters into print. Their implication: elect Thomas Jefferson and institute pro-French policies, or risk war with France. When Pennsylvania's popular vote tipped barely toward Jefferson, some disgruntled Federalists credited a day's strokes of diplomatic finesse, but it wasn't enough. Adams had plucked 2 electoral votes from the South and 1 from Pennsylvania. He snatched the Electoral College majority by 3 votes. If anything, a day had lost the election for Jefferson. Federalists rallied against the tawdry arts, as Abigail Adams called them, practiced against her husband by a combination of Jacobins, Virginians, and foreign influence. New England electors would sooner be shot than vote for Jefferson after a day's intrusion, cried one Adams supporter. While a day was promoting Jefferson's election in New England, Cullot and Warren languished in New Orleans, surrounded by bayonets. Suspicious of Cullot and Warren, Spanish officials had arrested the pair on October 27th and stuck them in a fort guardhouse, probably here. Warren had been slowly dying since his assault weeks earlier. Confined at New Orleans, he finally succumbed. Cullot buried his companion in the clammy soil. While imprisoned in New Orleans, Cullot convinced the Spanish governor that his enterprise would benefit Spain as much as France now that the nations had renewed their alliance. He had scribbled copious records about how to defend the region against Britain. He also possessed valuable intelligence about a vast conspiracy of British agents, their Native American allies, and British sympathizers in America who planned to attack Spanish forts. Secret sources had divulged the plot to him weeks earlier. Now, the conspiracy hadn't actually advanced very far, but a few ringleaders did relish its potential, especially the eminent Tennessee Senator William Blount. A Republican, Blount acted for money, not ideology. Desperately indebted, he eyed Britain as the savior of his tottering private empire in the West. Rumors swirled that France might reacquire Louisiana from Spain, something the British could not tolerate. Westerners, such as Blount, feared that France would close the Mississippi to them and possibly even incite slave insurrections in the region. Blount and Britain shared an interest in keeping France off the continent. Blount started to discuss the details with the new British minister in Philadelphia, Robert Liston. Captivated but cautious, Liston dabbled at the edges of the conspiracy. He vouched for the feasibility of the plan and sent one American to London to make the case to his superiors. Cullot knew few of the specifics of the conspiracy, and he got other details wrong, but he shared at least some of his intelligence with the Spanish governor while imprisoned in New Orleans. Impressed with Cullot's information, the governor paroled the Frenchman and shipped him back to Philadelphia. In Philadelphia, by early 1797, Cullot briefed a day and a Spanish diplomat, Marquis de Caserujo. Cullot informed them of the Blount conspiracy and other possible British aggressions, and he recommended strategies to prevail. Cullot's information arrived at a perfect time for Irujo. Spanish rulers had begun to second-guess their decision a year earlier to grant Americans access to the lower Mississippi River. They expected Irujo to stall the conferral. Spain couldn't yield the Mississippi because Britain was planning an invasion, Irujo explained to Secretary of State Pickering. Pickering demanded evidence for this claim, and Irujo had none other than the word of a French spy. But then he caught a break. That spring, one of Blunt's co-conspirators got drunk and began to prattle about secret correspondence he carried, a letter that outed Blunt and Liston. US authorities seized the letter, which landed in Pickering's hands by early summer. A devout Federalist, Pickering stared at evidence that the British minister was conspiring illegally with Americans to attack Spanish dominions from US soil. The letter damned Blunt, but it left just enough room for Liston to claim that Americans had tried to involve him in the plot, but that he disapproved. Anxious to exonerate Britain, Pickering accepted Liston's explanations. Enraged by Pickering's well, shall we say, selective naivete, Republicans lumped the secretary into the plot. Pickering was behaving in a very devilish manner, bellowed one. Another decried Pickering's collusive practices with the British minister. Still another rejoiced that Republicans could expose the criminality of the British minister and the partiality of our polite Secretary of State Pickering. House Republicans planned to drag Liston and Pickering down with Blunt. Even as the chamber impeached the disgraced senator and the Senate held impeachment hearings, James Madison preferred the term Liston's plot, refocusing attention on the British. The election of 1796 and its aftermath established a pattern of party line accusations of foreign collusion. Minority partisans accused the majority of wielding corrupt, foreign-supported power, while the majority alleged that their opponents cooperated with foreign agents to seize illegitimate power. For the first time in US history, majority and minority parties adopted strategies to wield foreign interference as an electoral cudgel, strategies that remain with Americans today and, as in times past, stoking their most legitimate fears and yet fueling their most outlandish accusations, perpetuating a cycle of partisan distrust. Thank you. And I should stop here to say, well, I have stopped. I should say here that I am happy to field any questions if anybody has anything they want to put in the Q&A box. So while, if anybody has any questions that they want to put in while they're, while you're typing them in, I should just follow up here and say that I had to leave a lot out of this. We could have jumped into the XYZ affair and the Alien and Sedition Acts. I talked a lot about Cullot, and Cullot was the principal target of the now infamous Alien Act, which allowed the president to unilaterally imprison, well, and deport any foreigner, any foreign national that he deemed dangerous. So this was a dangerous precedent of making the president, judge, jury, and executioner. And Federalists made no secret that Cullot was one of their targets, and of course Cullot would have been a legitimate target for targeting spies in early America, but Republicans saw this and quite rightly as as a heavy-handed Federalist attempt to seize political power. And so what we see with the Alien and Sedition Acts are Federalists really starting to enter extremes when it comes to trying to fight this boogeyman of foreign influence combined with foreign collusion from from domestic enemies. So a great question that's come up in our Q&A here is, hasn't our social media exacerbated this type of foreign influence? What can we do about this? And I think that's a terrific question. It's one I've thought a lot about as I've worked on the current book project that I'm writing, that this presentation will be a part of. Because the print media at the time was somewhat akin to our social media now. It was everywhere. Newspapers exploded in early America. It was a new technology, and nobody really knew quite how to wield it properly. And the newspapers at the time were very partisan. They made no pretense of not being partisan. And in fact, usually they were, Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, for instance, established their own, they cooperated with a friend to establish a newspaper specifically to trumpet their views. And so there are a lot of correlations between print media at the time and this new aspect of social media, which of course Russia has exploited with the IRA, as it's called, the Internet Research Agency, which Robert Mueller, of course, addressed in his report to Congress, that Russia has been using to try to needle American differences. And so the question becomes, what can we do about this? And I think that obviously is the, $60,000 question, as they say. I think that the best way to target misinformation, and specifically misinformation from foreign governments, is the best that can be done is to allow factual information. And to, I think we are doing what we can do, that a lot of, for all of the guff that the press gets, for all of the talk right now about partisanship in the press, there are a lot of good reporters who are doing their best to put out facts and information and, fact check. And that's what Americans tried to do at the time. It's countering misinformation with factual information. But that's a great question, and it's one that continues to plague us. And I think that the question really specifically gets at a larger question at the heart of American democracy, which is, who are the sovereigns in the United States? Because of course, we consider the people the sovereigns of the United States. And in early America, people like Caseirujo, who I referenced, he is going to make a very, and earlier than him, Edmond Charles Genet, who was notorious for intermeddling in US politics. Both of those ministers came up with very subtle and creative arguments that we can do whatever we want in US newspapers. We can print whatever we want. It's a free press. This isn't some monarchy in Europe. You allow public discussion of all of these issues. And so we are simply taking our case to the true sovereigns of the nation. And they can debate that in the public sphere. And so that is among the reasons that John Adams called foreign influence the angel of destruction to elective governments, because it's particularly difficult to control in a free government with free press, where the people can not topple the government, but topple the ruling party every 4 years, if we're talking presidential cycles. So So it's a very tricky question to deal with, and it's one that America has tried to deal with for a long time. I don't see that we have any more questions in the Q&A. So I can just end by again thanking Andrew and the American Academy of Diplomacy and everybody at the ICJS for having me today.
Well, thank you very much, Tyson. That was a really fascinating example of how early in our republic foreign influence, misinformation all began to enter the public sphere. And that really bridges us to what we're going to talk about now with the rest of this discussion of news, propaganda, and diplomacy. And it has been observed many times, it's not original, that the rapid evolution of technology has dramatically changed the ways in which information is developed. It has not necessarily changed the impact of information. I remember that when I was in the department, my colleagues probably have the same memory, that a great deal of many mornings was spent simply preparing press questions or answers for the questions that were about to come up, driven by whatever was in the morning paper. And so that is a constant. But what you have now is a multiplicity of information. And as we have seen with the endeavors of the Russians and the others, you now have much more sophisticated ways of introducing information, so that the dividing line between propaganda and news becomes finer over time. It may even appear to disappear. And these things have an influence, a considerable influence, on government, on how decisions are made, on how diplomacy is carried out. And then there's a reciprocal to that, that as the foreign or domestic propaganda and news influences diplomacy, so too does diplomacy have to try to contest, if you will, in the news media. And then you get into interesting questions like, should embassies have, ambassadors have tweets, and should they be regularly on social media? And are they really the representative of the sovereign to the other sovereign, or are they a representative of the sovereign, the United States, to the foreign public as a whole? And how does one differentiate that? And in the process, you've also, I think, reached a stage where the interaction of diplomats with news journalists, personalities, is almost constant. And their question is whether one does it very well. So what we wanted to look at as we open this panel up is to talk about these different aspects of how the evolution of news and propaganda has affected diplomacy. And we've got three really excellent speakers. We're going to be able to look at this from three different perspectives, so that David Pearce, Ambassador David Pearce, who's going to be on first, has dual background. He was a journalist for many years. He's covered numerous wars. He didn't find he got shot at enough there, so he went into diplomacy and deployed to some other wars. And so he has seen this picture from both sides. I must say, being ambassador to Greece is probably a little akin to being in a combat zone anyway, because Greek politics is pretty lively. So David has this perspective and can talk about how the evolution of news has occurred, how the evolution of the media has occurred and has brought changes in how diplomacy has to interact with the media. Ambassador Glyn Davies, a three-time ambassador, former executive secretary of the National Security Council, has also a particular beat, and that is he's going to focus on foreign propaganda and how it is distinguished from public diplomacy. And what is the difference? Why should one be concerned about the propaganda element? And then we can, in a sense, switch the tables and look at this, examine this question from a different perspective by turning it around, because we're very fortunate to have with us Carol Giacomo, who is a diplomatic correspondent for Reuters in Washington. She's a member of the New York Times editorial board. She's teaching journalism as well, and she's covered more wars and conflicts and diplomatic situations than I can count. And so Carol is able to talk to us about, in a sense, the same issue, diplomacy, propaganda, and news, but from the opposite perspective of the news person. So David, if you're up, I'm going to ask you to go ahead and start.
Well, Ron, I'm up. I can't see my video though. Let's see if we can get that going. Okay, here we go. There
you are. Okay.
Well, it's an honor to be here. Great talk by Tyson. Our thanks to the three co-sponsors. I'd like to get some slides up myself, which I will try to do now, and share my screen. Can you see that? Let's see. Okay. Well, I'll assume you can see my screen. Can you see the first slide, Ron?
No, can't see anything yet.
All right.
Oh, wait a minute. You just came up.
Okay. Well, what I'm going to do is provide a brief recap from a Foreign Service perspective on how the State Department has encountered the changing information landscape over the years that I've seen, and then a few considerations on some of the practical implications of this for diplomatic practice and training. So, see, next slide. For 9 years, I was a reporter, for 35, a diplomat. And in 1995, I actually wrote a book about how the two sides interact with each other. Next slide, please. I'd like to start in September 1980. I was a copy editor at the Washington Post on the foreign and the metro desks. And at that time, the Post computerized all of its operations. They put in a new Raytheon system, gave everybody a video display tube, a terminal, and took away the typewriters. So from reporter to editor to copy editor, headline writing, and down to photo composition, it was all done electronically. Next slide. So I say that because I want to contrast that with my experience when I entered the State Department. In January 1982, I became a Foreign Service officer. And I have to say, I was pretty shocked at what I saw in terms of the department's level of information processing. They had begun to introduce Wang word processors, which are kind of clunky and slow and not enough for everybody to have them. And there was a degree of institutional incoherence because every agency in town, the Pentagon, the State Department, NSC, CIA, Commerce, Treasury, they all had different systems. And even within the department, among the geographic and functional bureaus, for example, the European Bureau, Bureau of Economic Affairs, Consular Affairs, Near East Affairs, they were all like separate tribes. Each one had its own budget and procurement, and they all went out and got their own information architecture. The result of that was that if you're, for example, I was drafting a memo in the European Bureau and I had to clear it with consular affairs or the legal advisor's office or the undersecretary's office, I could write it on the terminal, but then I had to print it out and physically carry it from one office to another and get the actual initials of the clearing officer in those other offices. So there was a lot of running around the halls, as Ron will well remember. And I think this is a pattern that continued in the department. In my experience, we would adapt to new technology, but we would do it slowly. Next slide. There were some milestones. 1990-91, CNN and 24/7 news coverage, cable news came into their own with Desert Storm. And a few years later, CNN had more viewers outside the US than it did inside. And of course, we monitored CNN in the Ops Center at the State Department. Throughout the 90s and the early 2000s, mobile devices got smaller and more powerful every year. And with the internet, of course, there were more and more applications embedded. And the social media came to thoroughly disrupt the information landscape. Next slide. I confess I was a little slow to come to the uses of social media, in particular Twitter, until one day, 10 years ago in Kabul, it was September 13, 2011, 2 days after the 10th anniversary of 9/11. And the Haqqani network attacked us at the US Embassy. The big siren went off and we all did the duck and cover exercise, scrambled to the closest building. And the building I was in, I happened to be the senior person present, and it held the press operation and our public affairs folks. And I watched with fascination as they monitored minute by minute the Twitter accounts of the Afghan and international reporters who were following the conflict. So we had a real-time update, which was extremely helpful. And I became on the spot a convert to the uses of Twitter. And in fact, I established an account at my next job and I still keep it. Each of these technological developments, whether it was 24/7 cable news or satellite technology or more capable mobile devices or exploding internet and social media use, they all added not just to the speed and volume of available information, but also to the pressure on decision makers to respond. Next slide. So looking ahead, it seems pretty certain that if the last 50 years were crazy, the next 50 probably will be even nuttier. And I see three questions that this raises for the conduct of diplomacy in an changing information landscape. First of all, what changes? Second of all, what doesn't change? And third, how do you integrate what changes with what doesn't change? Next slide. So what changes? What changes is the field of play. The technology is going to change. That means the tools of diplomacy are going to change. The corollary of that is it's going to change. It's going to affect how governments deal with each other. And the other corollary is it's going to affect how publics receive and process information. Next slide. So what do we do? Well, first of all, we have to expect, we have to plan, we have to assume that technology is going to change and be on the lookout for that. And then when we see it, we need to adapt. And finally, don't wait like I did for a gun battle to be convinced. Next slide. So what doesn't change? What doesn't change is the substance of the job, which is engagement and advocacy. And it was put very well by Edward R. Murrow, the famous CBS broadcaster and USIA chief. He said, you can send information thousands of miles around the globe, but what really counts is the last 3 feet of person-to-person contact when it's delivered. Next slide. So the effectiveness of those last 3 feet is going to be conditioned heavily on the acquired skill and experience of the communicator. And I would say here that it's very important to remember that mere information collection is not a substitute for expertise. It does no good to have the fastest and the best intelligence in the world if you don't understand what it means when you get it and see it. So we need diplomats to take challenging assignments and develop area expertise and language skills. Next slide. So how do you put all that together? What changes and what doesn't change? Well, the first point following on the last one is that mere expertise isn't sufficient either. Unclassified and publicly available information often has a bigger impact on events, and especially breaking events, than official communications do. And what that means is it's not enough to be an expert, to have the meeting, to write the message and send it into Washington. Next slide. The efficacy of diplomats as instruments of national policy hinges not only on those traditional skills, but also on their understanding of how the information landscape works. It's going to hinge on their skills as both communicators and suppliers of information to their own government, to foreign governments, and to US and foreign publics via the media and social media. Next slide. So media literacy and public diplomacy should be core elements in the Foreign Service training continuum. Some of the things those might include, this is just my list, and I'm sure that there are a lot of other things that can be added. But one of them is institutional differences among media organizations. They're all different beasts at the water hole, as my Los Angeles Times friend Doyle McManus once observed. And all the different organizations have different needs and wants. Social media platforms also, how do they differ? There are a lot of them, there's going to be more. How do they differ? What are the algorithms? What drives them? And what uses are they to the official? And the third thing is official messaging. You need to know your own building, whether it's in Washington or in the field. You need to know who does what and where you fit in at any given point in time. Next, I would say ground rules and how to establish them. I found a lot of confusion about this among both diplomats and journalists. When I did my book, I interviewed 75 people on both sides, and it was fascinating to see how all the different ways that this was understood. So it's very important to understand what ground rules are and how you establish them. And finally, I would say tools like Google Analytics, because you need to be able to gauge the effectiveness of your online outreach. You're going to be doing it, so you need to be able to measure it. And I would just conclude by saying, in any career, 20, 30 or more years, a lot is going to change. Certainly did in my career. And I believe that media literacy training should really be updated at every step in a Foreign Service career. Thank you.
Hello, am I on?
I think it's over to you, Glyn.
Okay, thanks. Sorry about that delay of game. I'm together here, folks. Here, I'm with you. Look, I want to thank very much Ron, Academy colleagues, UVA hosts, and the Smith Center. Thanks to all of you who are joining us on this Halloween Eve. I've been asked to say a few words about propaganda, public diplomacy, and the importance of truthfulness in the conduct of diplomacy. Propaganda is hard to define. It's a somewhat emotive term. It puts one in mind of Potter Stewart's attempt to define another four-syllable word beginning with the letter P. And as we all recall, Justice Stewart threw his hands up and said only, "I know it when I see it." Propaganda is a bit like that. The most neutral definition I've come across defines propaganda as, quote, communication primarily used to influence an audience, which may not be objective and may selectively present facts to encourage a particular perception. Propaganda has always been a bit of a bad word for Americans. We tend to view it as a kind of a dark art practiced and nearly perfected by the dictators of the 20th century. Think of Riefenstahl's Triumph of the Will, for example. But America back then was also in the propaganda game, mostly for a domestic audience, but also for foreign consumption. Roosevelt's Office of War Information underwrote some forgettable films, so Hollywood picked up the slack, churning out propaganda features by the score before and during World War II. Now, America, instead of portraying the fervor of torch-bearing masses, our homegrown propaganda often used satire and even slapstick to pillory our enemies. We weren't quite as comfortable with the earnest style of the fascists or the communists. There's no small irony in the fact that Americans then and now view with distaste the notion that their government should produce propaganda. That's because our nation is particularly a creation of propagandists. The inspired pamphleteers who fanned the flames of revolution in America went on to proclaim their belief in a declaration evoked by a decent respect for the opinions of mankind. These were men of the pen, publicists of the highest sort, who advanced their ends by public argument in debates, which produced great state documents. That led us as a people to believe that it was only necessary to be ourselves a beacon to the world, and beyond our shores, people would see, they would understand, and repair to the banner we had unfurled. That something more was needed, except during the emergency conditions of wartime, was a concept alien to American minds before 1945. Like so many new ideas, the post-war view that the US government should create organizations devoted to telling the world about the United States, that was controversial. Many were skeptical of it, some were opposed. Before we assumed the mantle of world leadership and the existential threat of global communism emerged during the nuclear age, we largely disdained official foreign propaganda as unseemly and unnecessary. But after that, we got busy. Efforts were made to ensure that the information we disseminated would influence rather than inflame and would produce a rational rather than an emotional response. Voice of America has, from its inception, asserted a commitment to telling audiences the truth in an objective, independent manner. VOA's longstanding assertion gets at the useful distinction as terms of art between propaganda and public diplomacy. The NED issue brief we were provided does a good job of explaining that public diplomacy is distinguished from propaganda in that it more explicitly incarnates the intention to avoid spreading false information or using emotional means of persuasion. Now, many Americans, I believe, conflate propaganda and diplomacy. The widespread belief that as an open society, we have no need to project an airbrushed official image of America to the world is a close cousin of the conviction that we shouldn't need a large diplomatic establishment to explain who we are or to defend what we are about. The practice of American diplomacy is viewed, in fact, by many Americans as kind of a dark art. American diplomats are rarely portrayed in our popular culture, but when we are, we most often appear either as comic relief, as in Goldie Hawn's slapstick movie Protocol, or as knaves in cautionary tales, such as Costa Gavras' Oscar-winning film, Missing. Diplomats often join in the spirit of poking fun at their profession. It was, after all, a diplomat over 400 years ago, Sir Henry Wotton, who is said to have first joked that, quote, an ambassador is an honest gentleman sent to lie abroad for the good of his country. That was in 1604, and the quip lives on in various forms, no doubt kept alive by diplomats themselves. But the reality, as any practitioner of diplomacy knows, is that truth and credibility are essential ingredients of any successful diplomatic effort, indeed, of any successful diplomatic career. I had the experience while serving as our ambassador to UN agencies in Vienna of catching one of my ambassadorial counterparts out when he repeatedly misrepresented his country's stance on an important resolution before the IAEA. He was rallying members of his regional grouping to join in opposition to us, so we went to our embassy in his capital and we asked the question, is he indeed representing his national position? He wasn't. And lo and behold, he was swiftly removed from Vienna, which stunned me. I never expected we would precipitate such a dire professional outcome for the man. While I felt bad on a personal level for him, on reflection, it made sense. He had compounded insubordination with prevarication, which proved to be too much for his superiors. Now, that was an extreme and extenuating case. The more prosaic reality in diplomacy is that truth is the bedrock of credibility, and credibility is the bedrock of effectiveness. While it is rare that an untruth will sink your career, making a habit of deceit will quickly erode your effectiveness as a representative of your government. This isn't just a personal matter. When you speak as a diplomat, you speak for your country. If you utter falsehoods, it erodes the credibility of your country, and it can also have tragic consequences. We were all reminded of that 2 weeks ago when former Secretary of State Colin Powell passed away. Now, he was justifiably lavish with praise for his exemplary career, but the obituaries did not shy from recording the forced error he committed in telling the United Nations Security Council that Saddam Hussein was developing weapons of mass destruction. To Powell's great credit, he owned up to his mistake. In retirement, he never sought to excuse or live down his role in establishing a false predicate to the Second Gulf War. What a tragic shame that a man who had played such a statesmanlike role in ending the First Gulf War allowed himself to be manipulated in such a way by those for whom truth was no impediment to launching a second costly conflict. Powell's role in that episode saddened me. Earlier in his tenure as secretary, I was serving as political director for the US-hosted Sea Island G8 Summit. On one occasion, we invited all of the political directors of the other 7 G8 countries to Washington to finalize the communique for the leaders' meeting. Secretary Powell hosted a working luncheon for the diplomats on the department's 8th floor. At the table during the conversation, differences arose among several delegates over a couple of sentences. They were going back and forth about some language in the draft communique, language about which the United States, quite frankly, was agnostic. Sitting next to the secretary, I passed him a note, and I suggested that he maybe tell the disputants that they shouldn't hold up consensus because of differences over the form of a few words. Powell glanced at it, scribbled something on my note, and with a small smile, he handed it back. Words matter, he had written. I took that lesson to heart over the final 15 years of my career. Words do matter in diplomacy, and whether they are uttered by a journeyman diplomat, a secretary of state, an ambassador, or especially a president, all should strive to show a decent respect for the opinions of mankind. Thank you very much.
Hi, so thanks very much also to the Academy and to our other sponsors for what I think is an important conversation at this moment. I'm going to look at this issue from the point of a journalist who has been a journalist for a very long time and has spent most of my time in Washington covering US foreign policy. From my point of view, our first problem with disinformation is not overseas or from overseas, but domestically. At the moment, I'm way more worried about Fox than I am about the Russians. For America to be an international leader, it has to be strong at home. The government has to govern and democracy has to function, and to have the policy, cultural, and other debates that we need to have as a nation, we have to be able to have a common fact base. For instance, a mob stormed the Capitol on January 6th to overturn the results of the election. That's a fact. And yet there are many Americans who don't believe it. The government never tells us enough. Certainly in my experience, I always want public officials to tell me everything. But the last administration was extreme in my experience. And I think that weakens our ability both to project American leadership overseas and to accomplish what we need to accomplish at home. So yes, the Russians have been very clever at disinformation and have had some impact at shaking up our system. But as you know, we've been told, and we all know, those kinds of dark arts have gone on for a long time. Recall even just in the recent past, the disinformation game that the Russians played in Georgia in 2008. And the United States really only caught on to what the Russians were doing in our elections in 2016. During the Cold War, lies took months, maybe years to circulate. Now they overwhelm the system in a matter of days, and they appear on open source channels like RT and Sputnik, as well as via the cloak and dagger route. China is also a player, albeit more focused on its more central issues like Taiwan. Iran, of course, is active, but doesn't compare to the others. That said, we are in more challenging moments. There are more actors out there trying to create conflict and promote untruth. News and lies travel at sonic speed. Social media contributes to widespread dissemination of lies, and their algorithms, of course, send people into the darkest corners. But there is value, and I came to realize this during the Arab Spring when I was writing editorials for the New York Times, and could get the most immediate updates of what was going on in Tahrir Square because people were tweeting in real time, and it was extremely useful for me. We saw social media then as much more of a tool of democracy and allowing many more people to have a voice. And now of course, we realize that it can be misused in a very seriously problematic way. There are other problems that we're facing. There are more threats against journalists. Authoritarians have felt emboldened to attack the press in a way they never did before. I'm not saying there weren't threats before, but it clearly has increased. And part of that is because a president in the United States, a country that has been a bastion of free press and values of open discourse, attacked the press in unparalleled ways at home. When I grew up as a reporter, I felt invincible and that I could go anywhere, but not anymore. There are other issues, which of course I'm sure many of you are aware of. The media outlets are shrinking. The new ones, many of the new ones that are being founded are focused on Washington and the federal government. It's great to have more focus on government in general, but we have news deserts in local communities and in states where we also need to have coverage. I would cite Afghanistan as a case in point where you see shifting news focus as being a problem until the United States pulled out, I guess it was 6 weeks ago or so. There hadn't been all that much coverage of Afghanistan, I would say, in the last few years. And then during that one period when the attempts were made, where the troops were pulled out and we had to rescue so many Afghans, there was intense coverage, and now it has shifted again. I think in general, there has been less coverage of foreign issues, certainly in the American press, and more focus on domestic politics, precisely for the reason that I cited early on. We have an existential threat here at home, and in a way, it's understandable, but we're losing, I think, an understanding of what's going on more generally overseas. Sometimes news organizations publish disinformation, and it's inadvertent, it's sloppy. I would cite the New York Times series that was done called Caliphate, in which a gentleman who told the story about being in Syria and fighting with jihadis became the subject of a podcast with the Times, as well as stories. And it turns out that his story was false, and the podcast and the reporting was discredited. So we can make mistakes ourselves. We are misled by other people. It reinforces the fact that we have to do better reporting. I'd also cite a case in terms of disinformation. I had an experience myself in 2016 when a Russian, I was with the New York Times editorial board at the time, and we got a call. We had written an editorial that was very critical of Poroshenko, who was president of Ukraine at the time, and we criticized his failure to, deal with corruption. And somebody called us up and sent a letter, actually, and then we talked to him on the phone, and he wanted to set up an interview with us and Poroshenko. The whole thing ended up being a hoax, but fortunately we were suspicious about the whole process as it went along, and we never wrote anything until we had determined that it was in fact a hoax. The people who were promoting the hoax, I'm not exactly sure what was. It was a Russian guy, and he was probably trying to discredit both the Times and the Ukrainians. But, if we hadn't had an instinct that things weren't correct, the paper would have been discredited, and it would have, I think, also probably had a critical effect on the Ukrainian presidency. But despite and we haven't mentioned this before, but one of the areas where disinformation is most active today, and it's usually the Russians doing it, is with the COVID pandemic. Spreading all kinds of lies about the vaccine and about the extent of the pandemic, the virus, and where it came from. But the press is pushing back here and overseas. You have the rise in the last, I would say, 7 years of fact-checking organizations. The Washington Post has a fact checker, which is extremely good. There's a group called factcheck.org. Another group called PolitiFact. Turkey had built, the civil society in Turkey had built a credible fact-checking organization there. And the guy who founded it is now with Poynter. the Poynter Institute. The EU is now publishing weekly a disinformation report that tracks fake stories and how it gets picked up. Just this week, they were focusing on the stories that are still circulating about COVID. One story represented COVID as a biochemical attack on humanity by globalists. Other stories talked about how vaccines are useless, and there are other subjects as well, such as NATO will drag the Baltic countries into nuclear war. So the good news is that the EU, fact-checking organizations, other people who are operating in this space are trying to encourage a new problem-solving approach to information. And the idea is that it's better to try to prevent misinformation from spreading at all than to try to debunk it once it's spread, because lies travel faster and are more enduring sometimes than the truth. So the idea is to try to inoculate people against false or misleading information to begin with fact-based reporting, with logic-based arguments, with reminding people that there are efforts out there to manipulate the news, manipulate what they get, and to try to teach people. And I think maybe David had mentioned the whole question of media literacy, not just, it's important not just for diplomats, but for people. It should be taught in the schools. So young people learn how to distinguish both on social media and in the mainstream media, what's a credible news organization, what's a credible fact. I'll mention the New York, a few things that the Times is doing because I know that best. One thing that the paper has done is, I think, try to affirmatively build more trust with its readers. On page 3, you'll notice there is a story almost every day that tries to give an inside view of how a reporter got a story, why a reporter or photographer went after a particular story or a particular image, and some of the thought processes that went behind that. And the idea is to, I think, tell readers something I grew up knowing, but apparently most people don't really understand these days, that as journalists, we actually go places to do reporting. We talk to people, we talk to different people, and all in an attempt to try to get, understand all the equities in whatever news story we're after, and then put the story together. The paper is also doing, you may have noticed, lots of videos, lots of what one would call, I think, forensic videos, where, and one that was very popular, of course, had to do with January 6th. And the journalists, the video journalists at the paper put all the pieces together, timelines of where people were, what pictures occurred at what moment, to try to give viewers and readers of the paper a visceral sense of here is the forensic information that we have of what went on. And so you can see it for yourself and better integrate this piece of information, this video, with what you were reading about what went on that day. So anyway, so one other question I was asked to address was, how does this affect relationships? How does this disinformation environment affect relationship with diplomatic colleagues, foreign contacts, domestic audiences? In general, I'd say with sources, the basics are the same. We have to do our reporting. We have to be rigorous in our reporting. We have to seek multiple sources for a story. And you have to rely on your instinct. If something doesn't feel right, you got to keep digging until you really find as close to the truth. I mean, can we ever find the truth? As close to the truth as you can possibly get. I do know the thing is that we won't win if we traffic in lies. And to some extent, that's a problem with every administration. But as I mentioned, and I don't want to be too political, but one has to be factual, nothing compares to the last one. US strength has been and will be in telling the story of this country truthfully. The West has CNN, BBC, and PBS, other news outlets, which have a longer reach and a better product than some of the outlets that are available to those overseas who are trying to corrupt the information that we receive. We also have USIA and VOA, which are supposed to report all facets of the American story truthfully. And when they do that, I think it is they're a useful tool for introducing America and what's the best of America, both in terms of, what it does right and what it does wrong to the world. Diplomats, I think, have to understand more clearly that, if the American people don't understand why we execute a foreign policy, why we adopt a foreign policy, it's a lot harder for them to understand it and to support it. So to me, there's a self-interest in diplomats talking to reporters, trying to explain what America is doing and why. And I think that having diplomats available on social media is a good thing. I think obviously press conferences and small sit downs with reporters to have a serious conversation about policy is also important. So I'll stop there.
Great. Well, thank you to all three of our panelists, to Glyn and to Carol and to David. I've got a number of questions in the chat. I'm going to start with one of my own, though, and that is that for many years, and I think even now, the United States has been accused of doing a very poor job of selling itself overseas. And the question is often put in terms of, why does the country that has the greatest development of media in the world do such a crummy job of getting its own views across? There have been a number of efforts to change this, sometimes in a more propagandistic fashion. The establishment of, particularly in the Arab world, of Arab language media, and yet, and some things like a ready response operation that was set up overseas to provide responses more quickly. But overall, the impression is that the US does not do as effective a job as it could in simply explaining itself. And I wanted to ask our panelists to go around in a quick run. One, do you agree? And if you agree, what do you think needs to change, or where do you see the problem? David, why don't we kick off with you?
Okay, Ron, I think that's absolutely true, and I totally agree. And I also thought that Carol made some great points about media literacy, not only for diplomats, but for the public at large. And I think that the challenge, as you said, is explaining why things that happen overseas matter to people here, as Carol said. And I would offer two things. One is in terms of our own training, whether it's you have to understand the media landscape if you want to take part in it. Otherwise, there's almost no point. So I would say from day one in A100, our beginning training, through mid-career to senior level, make sure people understand the basics. Second thing I would just say is we need to upgrade the technology. And I could talk more about this, but there's a lot of research lately showing that audio and podcasts are a trending thing, for example. I had fun going to the State Department website the other day and looking up how many podcasts were. I found some from 2016, 5 years ago. And I went into the newsroom and I found a good briefing by Amos Hochstein on energy in Europe It took me 6 steps to get to that, clicking through various things, downloading an audio link, and then I got a 30-minute presentation. Contrast that with a think tank that I follow that sent me an email. And in the email, there was a link to a conversation, a 6-minute podcast between 2 experts on politics in the Gulf, between Kuwait and Qatar in particular I was interested in. I clicked on it, I clicked start, and I had a 6-minute thing. The other thing is that thing came to me. I didn't have to go to it and look for it. So I think we really need to look at our own, not just training people, but also the way we present stuff and explain it. We need to keep track of the way the media is developing and develop a better response as it goes.
Glyn, I'm going to let you pick up on this. And as we go to you and to Carol, I'd like you also to reflect on the question of the balance between spin, that is trying to put a favorable slant on a story, and maintaining credibility. My personal view, just put my cards on the table, is that we as the government tend to lean far too far towards spin, and the result is nobody believes what we're saying. But over to you.
Well, yeah, no, I think that's right. I spent a couple of years as deputy spokesman of the State Department, which Carol knows me from that era, and it was a pretty grueling kind of a process, because it is so difficult to kind of get across America's messages against the fire hose, the wall of sound that is coming at you, not just from the people asking the questions, but also from your bureaucracy. I would often get guidance that was simply unserviceable if I was representing the United States of America at that podium. And then, you're faced with a tough situation. Do you tap dance? Do you try to spin? Spinning, to me, I was never that good at it. I'm no Michael McCurry. And during my couple of years of, being chained to that podium at the State Department, I never went there. There are ways to do that, but you do it offline. You do it on the phone. You do it in private conversations with journalists. I think that's the way to do it. And I do find it a bit frustrating that after, we've been doing this at the State Department since the Iran hostage crisis, and yet we still can't quite smooth it out and ensure that we are able to provide the same high quality message to the media, which comes with their A game every single day to the State Department, with the exception of the last administration didn't want to do this, which I thought was reprehensible, posing these questions to you. And so I think, we've got to be more serious about it. The Pentagon does it. They do all kinds of media training, and they raise a cadre of officers through various ways. They've got 50 times more people than we have, but who are professionals in this. But for the United States Foreign Service, this is a close cousin of our long philosophy that, hey, anybody can do any job. Give them half a day and a dossier, and they'll go out there and do the job. And it's simply not the case when it comes to explaining to the media our positions on a day-to-day basis.
I would endorse everything Glyn said, but I would, a couple of things. One, I would cut the team there a little bit of slack, because it's a rebuilding moment after a complete decimation of the department and almost every function in the government, including truth. And so I'm willing to give them a little bit of slack, and I think they're trying certainly more than the previous people did, which, the previous team often didn't talk at all. So, really didn't talk at all. And I would also say that the tone is set from the top. Okay, if you have a Secretary of State who, go even farther, if you have a president who believes in truth and trying to explain policy to the American people, then that message should filter down to the people who are actually talking on a regular basis. But I do think that I have I've spoken often over the years to the Foreign Service Institute, and there is a certain built-in kind of resistance to going too far and talking with reporters. But I think that there needs to be better training, a better understanding of how explaining American policy ultimately, I think, redounds to the benefit of the government, because the more the American people understand what you're trying to do, hopefully, the better chance that they will support what you want to do.
Carol, thank you. I'm going to let you continue and then see if our colleagues want to add. I've got a combination of questions. One that came from Jim and Morgan Perkins, who've often been strong supporters of this program. And they referred to a new program that Tucker Carlson is airing or is about to air, a documentary called Truth About January 6th. And they asked, is this propaganda? And how can it be contradicted, assuming that you think it is propaganda? But there was another question which asked, and here I'll ask David and Glyn to weigh in as well, and that is, how do American diplomats, or how should American diplomats explain overseas to foreigners the multiplicity of voices and views which come forth in the United States? Carol, over to you.
Okay, Fox News and Tucker Carlson. Look, I have not seen this documentary. I have just read about it. It does, from what has been said about what it purports, it does sound like it is just a continuation of Carlson's stream of lies and misrepresentations of what's going on. I don't understand, other than why someone would do this, other than profit motive, but nevertheless, how can it be contradicted? I mean, there's a lot of reporting about it. There's been pre-reporting about it before it actually was shown. I think that's a good thing, because it tells people this is controversial. There are a lot of smart people, thoughtful people, who think this is completely, over the top. So we do, but Fox has a huge viewership, and it seems to me that ultimately the only thing that's going to affect this kind of trajectory in reporting is for sponsors to pull out and viewers to just say, enough. I'm not going to do this anymore. I mean, how else can you have an impact?
David, let me pick up with you on the question of, you've got all these voices out there. You've got our news channels, and you've got, of course, all the purposeful streams. How do diplomats manage to explain the U.S. coherently?
Well, it's a challenge, Ron. But what I do is I simply say, look, there's a lot of voices in our country, and people express them, and you just in our system of government, the premise is that over time we'll get it right. And I think Jefferson said the same thing, actually. He basically said that you have to trust that even if there are errors made, that over time people will be in the right place. And that's the sort of the fundamental premise of democracy. And I'm always reminded, in terms of explaining things to people, when I worked for UPI, we had a basic rule, which was, never underestimate the intelligence of your reader, but never overestimate his or her fund of information. So that is to say, you do need to explain, and that goes not only in the U.S. but also overseas. So we have to engage overseas, and the same thing I said about the mechanics of explaining domestically apply overseas. The embassies have to be out there and engaging too, and that's an argument for the intelligent use of social media, I think.
Glyn?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, what I found, a couple of strategies. One is you try to bring out those voices to the post. If you can't do it, physically, you do it kind of in virtual reality. And we used to do a lot of debates. In fact, a very highly placed royal, not the king of Thailand, used to bring her students over to the embassy, and they would have a debate before American elections, and then they would vote. So to try to give them that kind of sense of it, but if we could bring out speakers to speak to the various points of view in the United States. The other thing is to kind of remind them of the basics of the of America, how we're set up, our zeitgeist, our DNA, that we're a federal system. We've got 50 little experiments in democracy in the States, that we're a nation of nations. I would often point out that in the tragedy of 9/11, people from 90 different nationalities perished, as an illustration of the fact that we're this kind of Tower of Babel of different people. And then you also explain to them the basics of things like freedom of speech, so that they understand our Constitution, our fundamental freedoms. And the final thing I'll say is that, social media helps a great deal here, because especially in my last post, a plugged in place like Thailand, very young, everybody's on social media. The world's in their pocket. They know what's being said. They can look at social media. They can look at Facebook. A lot of it is, frankly, garbage, but the smarter ones can kind of sift through, and they understand what freedom of speech means in reality, because it comes to them every day in real time.
Thanks. One question, I think we've got the right mix of people here to address it, is how do diplomats and journalists work together, more or less together, overseas? How should they collaborate? How should they not collaborate? And Carol, you want to pick up on that? You certainly had experience there.
The word collaborate, I kind of bristle at that word. Okay. We both have jobs to do, and they're different jobs. But if I'm overseas reporting, I certainly want to know what the Americans are thinking. And so it's useful to know what the Americans are thinking, both in terms of sort of the analytical view, and also in terms of what actually what the policy is and how the policy is being implemented. So there is a symbiotic relationship there, but it would be any sort of hint that there is some common purpose. Maybe there's a common purpose, but there's not always a common purpose, and there's going to be tension. I think so. You need each other, but I won't be your favorite person all the time. I may never be your favorite person, but I do try to, approach what I do with purpose and with integrity, and put my cards on the table. I'm a reporter, and I need to find this out, and I like to have serious discussions about policy and understand. So there can be common purpose, but we're not collaborators, and there will more often be tension than agreement, and that's the way it is. That's the nature of the jobs.
No, I think that's fair, that it's not collaboration in the sense of a common purpose at all, but it is interaction.
It's interaction.
But David, you've also been on both sides of this, as a journalist first and then as a diplomat. So your reflections.
Well, I would go even further than Carol. I would say that there's a fundamental contradiction between what journalists are trying to do, which is to expose and shed light on things as they're happening, and what diplomats are trying to do, which is they have an interest in explaining, but usually in terms of end results. So along the way, oftentimes, if you're conducting a negotiation, for example, it's not in your interest for things to get out to do it in the media, because it constricts the room for maneuver and and actual engagement. So there's a fundamental difference in approach between the two sides. However, I think that, so I guess I would say that if both sides are doing their jobs properly, neither side will be happy or satisfied. But I think the greater risk is not to engage, because we have a need both to explain why things are the way they are, and we have a need to get stuff done. So.
Yeah, I would certainly agree with that. When I first went to Baghdad during the occupation period, our media brief was so heavy on spin that it had really destroyed any credibility. So my sense was the starting point for any journalist listening to that was to say, okay, what's wrong with it? So that it absolutely did not fulfill its purpose of persuading anybody of much of anything. I'm going to go into another question, and that is asking each member of the panel. I'm going to start with
Ron. Do you mind if I just quickly
please,
jump in on that? No,
go
that's
ahead.
okay. Look, I mean, you asked, how should diplomats and journalists get along? Great question. I'd endorse everything that's said, so I don't have to waste much time here. But I did two quick things. Number one, stay in touch with journalists. Make an effort, to talk to them. In Bangkok once a quarter, I'd have the wires over. The New York Times was there, CNN, some of the others, and we'd get together with some ground rules to kind of protect everybody's innocence, and we'd just have a conversation. It'd be kind of far-reaching, far-ranging, and pick up some intel from each other. But yeah, there were guarded moments. The second thing, quickly, is there is still in the DNA of Foreign Service officers this real neuralgia about talking to journalists. They make the sign of the cross at them too often. And I think Foreign Service managers would do well, as I had, like one Ray Caldwell 30 years ago, who did this for me, to say, yeah, go ahead and talk to journalists. Be responsible, let us know, don't step in the bucket, but go ahead and make yourself available. And I think institutionally, we in the State Department can do a much better job of bringing up, Foreign Service officers and civil servants who are free to responsibly interact with the media.
And that really leads us straight into a question from Bob Beecroft, Ambassador Beecroft, which he posed to David Pearce, but I think it really goes perhaps to everybody, but certainly Glyn to continue, and then to David, which is, what should the State Department be doing to upgrade and transform the training of Foreign Service officers at the beginning of their careers and throughout them? And so, Glyn, I'm going to let you continue because you began to get into that, and then we'll go to David.
Sure. Well, it's what I was saying before. I think there ought to be this kind of a cultural change. In terms of practical ideas, I remember when I was tapped to be a deputy spokesman at the State Department working for the amazing Nick Burns, they sent me over to the Pentagon for media training. And I thought, well, it was good. They've got good stuff over there, and it helped a lot. They put you through various scenarios, but I thought to myself, this is kind of nuts. In Washington, historically, and I think still today, there are really three major briefings every single day at noon: White House, Pentagon, State Department. Other federal entities talk to the press, but those are kind of the big three when it comes to what's going on in the world. And yet, we don't really raise in our ranks people who are comfortable and allowed to do that. So that's what I would do better.
David?
Well, I went into a bit of it earlier in terms of the kinds of things like understanding the structure of the media and the needs of different organizations. For example, what does a print journalist require? What does a radio or a TV journalist require? What's the difference between the forester and the strip miner? If you're overseas, somebody who's going to be coming back to the well every once in a while, who's based in the area, who's a real expert, or somebody who's parachuting in and it doesn't care if they ever see you again. You have to learn to assess these things, and it's a learnable thing. but it does require practical training, in my view. There are things like, ground rules is could be a whole day. You could bring in reporters and diplomats and get them to talk about how they talk to each other. I was told when I was writing my book by Tom Friedman, there's no such thing as off the record, and you shouldn't use the term. If you want to go on background, that's fine. There's deep background too, which is not for attribution at all. But you can then say, but if, we have this nice talk, but at the end of it, if there's something you think is so compelling as a quote, come back to me, we'll talk about how we source it. And it's not hard to do, but you need to do it up front and not after the fact, because once the genie's out of the bottle, you can't put it back in again. You can't say, oh, don't use that, and I'm sure that happens all the time. I'll give you one example, and it's an old one. Former Ambassador Chip Bolin, former ambassador to the Soviet Union, came up with what were called the Bolin rules, and Paul Nitze told them to me from memory, and I can't do it from memory, so I'm going to read them. But the first one is to always take the press seriously. They can really hurt you or help you, and they're important to what you care about. Always return calls and try to answer questions frankly. Second thing, never tell the press an untruth, because if you do, it'll come back to bite you. And that said, number three, you don't need to tell the press everything. They may make fun of you or try to get you to say things you don't want to, but they'll understand, no comment. Next thing is never discuss an iffy proposition, because if you get into that, you're probably going to get it wrong. And number five, never deal with a question that's in the process of being decided in the executive branch, because again, you'll get it wrong if you do. No comments, usually a better reply. Six is never denigrate a fellow worker in the executive branch, because you might find out that they can pee on you more skillfully than you can pee on them. And the seventh is, if you don't know the answer to a question, don't be afraid to say so. So I think things like that are useful, but they need to be taught.
So Carol, from your interaction with diplomats, if you could say, there's three things I really want to train them in, other than telling me all their secrets. What would those 1, 2, or 3 things be?
Well, I mean, both Glyn and David, I think, really put a lot of important things on the table. I have always valued the ability to sit down and actually talk about an issue, in depth. Look, I don't just want to know what's happening today or tomorrow, but I want to talk about how it fits into America's, view of itself, where that particular administration is going, the sort of the analytical view, because that to me is how I can do reporting better and explain the story better and explain the policy better. So, or criticize the policy, but at least if I know what all the component parts are, I have a better chance of doing a better job of explaining or critiquing any policy. And the honesty part. I mean, years ago when I was first at the State Department as a reporter, somebody in EUR lied to me. I mean, straight out lied to me. And I never forgot that. And I never spoke to that person again. I found all kinds of other ways to get around that person. I wasn't going to deal with somebody who lied to me. And the other thing I would say is, officials who think that they can shut you out and penalize you. I had a very, very senior person once tell his department not to talk to me. And, I'd been there longer. I knew more people, and he couldn't shut me out. And so I think that, vindictiveness, or if you think you can punish a reporter, it's usually not successful. So those are my ideas.
Thank you. Now, I will throw in that I thought some of the best advice I ever had was from an Algerian friend who had now passed away, but he had run the insurgent propaganda against the French during the revolt against the French. So he was pretty good at this. And he said to me once, he said, when you have a bad story, never apologize, always explain. And I find that American diplomats as a whole are very poor at explaining what the logic of a policy is. And if you do that, my experience is you can often walk away with people's respect, even if they still don't agree with the answer where the policy is going. But we don't do that very well. I have a question here from Amelia at the Hotchkiss School, and she wants to know how the January 6th insurrection affected how other countries, allies, and trade partners see the U.S. I don't know if there's a simple answer to that, but we can whip around once. Who wants to start on that one?
I'll take a stab. I mean, the truth is, I don't know. But then there's the sort of trite answer, which I'm afraid does still have some truth in it, because I have spent a little bit of time overseas since January 6th. People don't really care. I mean, unless you're talking to the real jefe grandes, the hoi polloi in a capital city, most people aren't really that interested. I think for the most part, though, people in leadership positions were appalled by it. They were appalled by it, and it scared them in a way, and they still don't really know how to process it. And I think this remains an ongoing challenge for serving American diplomats to try to explain how such a thing could have happened. And then, final thing, our justice system needs to do its job. Mm-hmm. And they need to be held to account, because we still have, last time I checked, an independent judiciary and rule of law, and we need to demonstrate that that's functional and working in this instance.
Mm-hmm. David?
Yeah, I guess I would agree with that. I think, of course, people found it shocking, and others would be cynical about it. But, I think it probably is going to depend, as it does here, on, where you sit and who you are. It's going to be different all over the world. And I actually agree with Glyn's point. I mean, not all the cards are in yet, because we don't know how this ends. Is there going to be accountability or not? I think that will affect people's final judgment about what its real meaning is.
Carol, you're in and out of the country and talking to others.
I thought the reaction was even more widespread in a negative sense than Glyn suggests. And I think it's because we're not just talking about the event of that day, but the larger picture of how it reflects division and dysfunction in this country. And I think that there are a lot of people who are looking at the United States and really wondering maybe part of this is my own projection, but really wondering what is going to happen to us if our experiment in democracy and governance fails. What chance is there for other democracies around the world?
Yeah, I think we have time for one more question. I apologize to a couple of people because we're not going to get to every question, but we're going to need to move on to Nick Schifrin's closing speech in a minute. But this is an interesting one. And it says that some panelists observed that international coverage is not as pervasive in the US as it used to be. Is this so? And if so, how to fill the gap? And so if we could, I think, Carol, you've got the closest up view of that, but if we could go around once on that question of what's happened to US foreign coverage.
I think this is my perception. I haven't done sort of a granular accounting of this, but my sense is we're way more focused now on the politics in the United States. I mean, there's some people are focusing on democracy and the voting rights and that the existential question. But I think there is a sort of category of just American domestic politics and how that is dominating coverage with, you know, the infrastructure bill and Build Back Better and all that sort of stuff. And so I perceive there to be less space and less attention on foreign issues. We're more domestically oriented. That's my perception.
Thank you. Glyn?
Well, yeah, no, I think that's right. I mean, to some extent, that it's sort of always been the case, I suppose, given the fact that we're a continental nation with essentially local concerns. But I think what's happened here is that traditional media that we had, the few networks and the great papers, used to do a great job of it. Many of the foreign services dried up. Thank goodness the New York Times, has maintained a presence overseas, and a few others are kind of building back to do that. But those days I think are really gone. So next comes the question of how do you use virtual means, social media, other ways to ensure that people get the ground truth about what's happening around the world, because it does affect us now more than ever. But I think it's just kind of a fact of life. I think there's been a shift, and I think we're, for the time being, going to be self-absorbed, and this is going to be what we'll deal with for some time to come.
Well, David, there has also been, though, a contraction of U.S. news media abroad and just covering things.
Yeah, I mean, with the ad, it really started quite a long time ago, and with the advent of 24/7 news, because the ad revenues went other places, and so that changed the structure and the ability of a lot of news organizations to maintain expensive foreign bureaus. And I think the foreign news hole generally has been shrinking over the years on one level, but the need to explain to people remains, whether you're a journalist or a diplomat, because the fact is that it's a very interconnected world, and what happens overseas matters here. And I think there's a general understanding there and that's something that we can work with. And I think the way to work with it is, for one thing, what we've discussed earlier, which is media literacy, not just for diplomats, but in general, so that people understand. There's one other thing I would make a pitch for. There are various organizations like World Affairs Councils. That's what they do, is try to show how world affairs plays in their local area. So joining and supporting things like World Affairs Councils is a great way to do it. I happen to take part in two of them, one in Maine, one in California.
Thank you. Well, I think we have run out of time. We have not run out of questions, and I apologize to a few people that we did not get to. I really want to thank David and Glyn and Carol for their very thoughtful participation in this panel. And now to bring our discussion of news and propaganda and diplomacy together, we have another chance, a different perspective, bring this all together. And this is from Nick Schifrin. Nick is the Foreign Affairs and Defense Correspondent for PBS NewsHour, so many of you will have seen him regularly. He leads the NewsHour's foreign reporting. He has created week-long in-depth series for NewsHours from China, Russia, Ukraine, more than I can recount here. His series Inside Putin's Russia won a 2018 Peabody Award. And generally, he has really made himself known as the master of very thoughtful, incisive, and in-depth coverage of a lot of foreign issues. So it's a great pleasure for me to pass to Nick Schifrin.
Ambassador Newman, thank you so much. David, Glyn, and Carol, it was a pleasure to listen to that panel. Just such interesting insight. And thank you overall to the American Academy of Diplomacy, the Robert H. Smith International Center for Jefferson Studies, and of course the larger University of Virginia Center for Politics. A journalist who became a policymaker once criticized me and my fellow journalists as peddling in anecdotes. Personally, I'm a journalist, so I actually think anecdotes are memorable and illustrative of larger points. So forgive me for beginning by peddling 2 anecdotes before zooming out and talking a little bit more strategically about the topic at hand. On March 3rd, 2014, I was in Novo Ozernoye in Crimea. And I was outside a Ukrainian base on what was still then officially Ukrainian land. But the newly arrived soldiers did not raise the Ukrainian flag, and the welcoming committee did not pledge allegiance to Ukraine. This was a point at which months of protests in Kyiv, as all of you will remember, led to a revolution in which a pro-Russian Ukrainian government fled Kyiv, replaced with a technocratic government, ostensibly pro-Western. And it, of course, led to the invasion by Russian soldiers of Crimea and its subsequent annexation. So in Novo Ozernoye that day, my team and I approached this base and wanted to speak to the Crimeans outside. The Russian troops a few hours before had occupied the base without firing a shot. And we realized that the Crimeans were bringing them sandwiches and tea. "We are here to support the Russian peacekeepers," one man told me. "They are the only means to stop the violence." "We think they protect us," a local woman told me. "Protect you from whom?" I asked. "Fascists in Kyiv," she said. "You mean the protesters 350 miles south? Have you seen any evidence that they're coming to you?" "No, but I've heard rumors," she said. "The Russians will protect us." Much, of course, has been made of Crimea's linguistic and cultural connections with Russia, with Crimeans' disappointment with a government in Kyiv that literally did not speak their language, but also wasn't listening to them. Years of requests of development aid and economic assistance had been discounted. But those opinions in Crimea, which were genuine, were largely a product of disinformation. And in this case, facilitated and produced by state-owned Russian television. By then, the Russian government had cut off Ukrainian-type TV in Crimea and replaced it with what Peter Pomerantsev, who's an excellent author on Russian disinformation, labeled the fire hose of falsehood. The demonstrators in Kyiv are Nazis, are fascists. So we, the Russians who won World War II, have to resist. Those fascists will come to destabilize Crimea, much like the West destabilized the Soviet Union or Russia after the Soviet Union fell, leading to breadlines and poverty. And that is what the message that Russian TV delivered to Crimeans. This is not news to inform, obviously. It is news to persuade. And it comes all the time, and it helped Russia annex Crimea. Second anecdote, a few months later, I will tell a shortened version of this one because I told a version of it last year to the American Academy. I was in Jerusalem after a punishing 6-week war in Gaza between Hamas and the Israeli military. And I was getting my watch fixed in Jerusalem. And the woman asked me who I was, and I explained that I had been a reporter in Gaza for the last 6 weeks, and I just left. And she said, "Did you tell the truth?" I was like, well, okay, I think I always tell the truth. It's like, "No, you reporters don't. Did you tell the truth that Gazan women throw their babies in front of our missiles?" That's what she thought, genuinely, that mothers in Gaza sacrificed their children in order to achieve a PR campaign led by Hamas. This is not true, obviously, and was a product of propaganda on Israeli television. So this is not only about our adversaries. This exists in many ways and has existed for many years. We cite a Mark Twain line often, that a lie travels around the globe while the truth is putting on its shoes. Turns out I did a little research. Mark Twain never said that. But anyway, the better quote perhaps is Jonathan Swift's. And I think this is a good overarching point for what we're going to talk about for the next 45 minutes or so. If a lie is believed only for an hour, it has done its work. Falsehood flies and the truth comes limping after it. So that when men come to be undeceived, it is too late. The tale has already had its effect. The impact of disinformation, misinformation, propaganda, which of course are all distinct, but the impact of all three cannot be overstated. It has existed as long as communication has, and as we're going to talk about later, and as you guys have been talking about, it truly does present an existential threat to a liberal democracy functioning. Of course, more recently, we have been focused on decades of Soviet active measures and then Russian active measures. We are focused today on Chinese disinformation efforts, propaganda efforts that have increased during COVID. And of course, we are looking at January 6th and why that happened and what people are still saying about it and how that leaves America. Now, news, the Reporters Without Borders says, is a vaccine to disinformation. I would love to believe that. And on its face, it's true. We heard Maria Ressa, who just won the Pulitzer Prize for peace, even though she's a journalist, talk about that idea that the only way to have a relationship between the government and the governed is to agree on a set of facts. And that's simply all she was trying to do in a country where the president, Rodrigo Duterte, did not want her to be able to deliver those facts. But the news is getting weaker, as you guys have been talking about. And disinformation is getting stronger. And there is nothing stopping that trend. And that trajectory, I would argue, of the media, of information, is mirrored in diplomacy, is mirrored in US influence. The US is relatively becoming less influential. Authoritarian regimes are growing stronger. And so that's what I want to talk about today. The media, diplomacy, the US ability to deliver diplomatic outcomes are symbiotic. They will fall, they will rise together, and the threat truly is existential. So let's talk about the news media getting weaker first. We can go through this pretty quickly. It's well known, but some of these stats are pretty extraordinary. A lot of my fellow journalists blame more competition. At the very least, this has meant less influence for the carefully curated news that we have come to believe in the last 120 years, the objective news chosen by editors who are either trained or experienced to do so. There is less funding in the news. We used to rely on classified ads, help wanted ads, stocks listings, subscriptions. I mean, it seems so quaint and silly right now, even general advertising, all of that has dried up. And what that has meant is that there are simply fewer journalists doing the work. From 2008 to 2019, the number of people employed by newsrooms in the United States dropped by 23%. So 1 out of every 4 journalists lost their job between 2008 and 2019. And while I couldn't find any studies that actually objectively measured this, it is, of course, unimpeachable to argue that has reduced the scope of journalism across the country. Of course, we saw a lot of that in 2016, missing entire swaths of the country and how they felt, but also all over the world. And you guys just talked about that. The reduction in foreign correspondence, CE, and the number of correspondents, TS, around the world. And what that has led to is less esteem for the media. The Edelman creates a trust barometer. This measures trust in the US and around the world. In their poll in 2020, 18% of Trump voters trusted the media. Okay, maybe that's a given. Only 50%, only 57% of Biden voters trusted the media. That's pretty low. Across the world, 59% of people in 28 countries said journalists deliberately try to mislead the public by reporting information they know to be false. And the most trusted source of information in that poll across 28 countries was Google. Reuters Institute of Study of Journalism in London or in Oxford recently had their own poll, and they found that consumers were judging media not on the basis of any perceived competence or any perceived objectivity, but whether the media was delivering what they wanted to hear. So at the same time we have that, I would also argue the US is becoming less influential. Just like in the media, more competition around the world has challenged US influence. The US is no longer the lender of last resort, according to President Obama in 2007. The moment when Beijing realized that the US could not bail out the rest of the world is the moment it realized that it could expand or fast forward or accelerate its already growing capacity to try and achieve its outcomes by coercion and through disinformation. And of course, the impact, just like in journalism, of US mistakes, whether January 6th or others, is less esteem around the world. And so these two things are symbiotic. That happens as authoritarianism is on the rise. We don't have to talk about what China looks like for the dissident, what Russia looks like for the dissident, what other countries from the Philippines to Iran to Saudi Arabia looks like for the dissident. It is what Freedom House calls a worldwide effort to silence criticism, and the journalists are targeted as well. The 2021 World Press Freedom Index says journalism is blocked in 130 countries, and only 7% of countries are offered to consider a good environment for journalism. And so what is the impact on the US of all this, of the news media getting weaker as the US is challenged more and as authoritarianism is on the rise? Diplomats can't rely on the media to debunk disinformation. Thanks to the arguments of fake news, diplomats find it harder to push the idea of journalism, the idea of the free-flowing idea of information as democratic. Whether the introduction of the word fake news or something we can talk about later, the pretty close to destruction of the US AGM, the parent company overseeing VOA and other journalistic outlets designed by the United States to reach into countries not to deliver propaganda, but to deliver facts. These things make diplomats' arguments more difficult. And all of that means that there is a much more receptive audience around the world, that as US trust, as global trust decreases in the US government and in the media, Russian messages are easier to deliver and are received in a much more receptive way. And so that's the environment that has allowed for this crisis of misinformation. Let us call it what it is, and I didn't invent this term, geopolitical gaslighting. That's what we're looking at here. Long before 2016, Russia had been doing this in its adversaries, in its backyard, whether in the Baltics, in Ukraine, in Georgia. And of course, it came to the US in 2016. And remember, it was equal opportunity outrage. That's what they were looking to do, not only elect President Trump, but to get us pissed off at each other, whether it was over Black Lives Matter, Hillary, Obama, Trump, immigration. A stat that is extraordinary to think about how successful disinformation was, take out the politics. 150 million Americans were exposed to Russian disinformation in 2016. That is 7 times the number of Americans who watch the evening network news. I'm going to repeat that. 150 million Americans read Russian disinformation in 2016 before the election. 1/7 of that watches the evening news. And of course, success begets success. Iran, Saudi Arabia, North Korea, Philippines, you name it. We've all seen the imitation of Russian tactics. We've also seen some of these tactics go to China. And this is absolutely essential as we examine our influence around the world. Some of the Chinese efforts in the last couple of years over COVID, for example, have been a little bit ham-fisted. There was a series of text messages that some of you might have received during COVID that were fake, that suggested that the President Trump was about to shut down the country. National Security Council staff had to release a statement. That was pretty easy to debunk. But a series of points of misinformation by Beijing has been much more difficult to debunk, in part because it's not aimed at the US. It is aimed at increasing Chinese influence around the world, and in so doing, reducing US influence. Chinese doctors are better qualified than those in the West. Chinese supplies in Europe, Southeast Asia, got there first before Western supplies could get there. The US was infighting while the Chinese government was helping local cities, and the death toll, even if the Chinese numbers are 1/10 of the reality, obviously the United States has largely failed compared to the Chinese government to defeat COVID. All of that, of course, shifts the blame away from China's failure to contain COVID in the first few weeks, and even regardless of whether it was a lab leak or a natural release. But like the Russians, what the Chinese goal is to portray China as the partner of first resort, to portray Western cohesion as weak and the United States as absent. This is about sowing division in the West, in NATO, in its allies, in order to enhance leverage, in order to allow China to focus on bilateral relationships where it can use economic pressure more effectively. Very difficult to combat. During COVID for Russia, same thing. European solidarity is a myth. EU assistance was inadequate. I'm leaving out some of the Russian examples that the vaccine will give you various diseases that we just heard repeated last week by President Bolsonaro in Brazil. And so into this environment, we have January 6th. And the question in front of us is, how impactful is the misinformation? Surely we can point out that the Chinese PPE was flawed. Surely we can point out through good journalism or diplomacy or statements by diplomats that in fact, no, we, the United States, have given more vaccine. We, the United States, have donated PPE with no strings attached, as the Biden administration says. Surely there's a way to do this. And we'll talk about what I think are the solutions in a second. But we've also seen the existential threat. Can liberal democracy become ungovernable because of this information? A person either wins an election or he or she does not, or so we thought. A vaccine is safe or it is not. Maybe not. Our very basic assumptions require a level of trust in the source, whether United States government or journalists. And as we've laid out, that trust has been eroded. And where there is no trust, there are no facts that we can agree on. People will choose perception over fact. They would prefer the media that gives them what they want over the media that provides them what they need. Enough people choose alternative facts, the Russians win. I remember talking to a Russian journalist named Michael Zigar, who used to run TV Rain, one of the few Russian television channels that actively opposed the Kremlin, or at least criticized the Kremlin when it deserved it, and exposed corruption. They've long since been shut down, their journalists persecuted. He described that Putin is not some all-knowing puppet master. By no means is he. And after the anecdote that I started with in 2014 when the Russians took Crimea. Inside Russia, Moscow, the Kremlin, experimented on Russian TV through its cutouts on Russian television. And they experimented with the message that they think would work. And the first message was what I heard, right? The idea that we saved Ukraine from a pro-American fascist Nazi mob in Kyiv. And a few months after I left Crimea, the Kremlin realized actually that doesn't work so well. Second argument was the West is dying. You know, the West doesn't know what it's doing. Look, it's infighting. There's all these immigrants, you know, it's not working. And they found that wasn't as effective either. And then they hit on this thing about no facts. And obviously it's been around in Soviet history and Russian history before for forever. But this Kremlin in the last few years realized that this argument was the most effective. That is that they are corrupt, meaning the United States and the West. Their democracy is a sham. We may be corrupt too, and our democracy might be a sham too, but because they are corrupt and their democracy is a sham, it does not exist, the ability to have democracy. There are so many opinions there. Who could possibly know what a fact is? And when there are no facts, disinformation about the US, about Europe, can spread more easily. Russian media can find more eyeballs. And of course, we see how that has become domestic in the United States as well. And extraordinary thing, you don't always need to silence the dissident. In this case, you can drown him out. What the political scientists call censorship through noise. Okay, so journalists like to throw peanuts. We like to criticize. We like to challenge. We don't often suggest solutions. And so I will talk a little bit about what I believe is the antidote, knowing full well that it's perhaps, well, it is my place to talk about the antidote, but knowing full well that it's not generally what journalists do. And so you might not be surprised that I would argue that accuracy and transparency is the only antidote because they are our greatest strengths. What does the world see in America, if not for the reason that America was born, that government can only function by the consent of the governed? Our willingness to confront our flaws actually challenges the authoritarian model, the authoritarian argument against us. And here too, the situation in my mind applies both to the media and diplomacy. Transparency and accuracy. The BBC is not respected. Let me rephrase that. The BBC is respected because it is not state-owned media. It is not seen as propaganda. Public diplomacy is respected when it is not a PR campaign. Public diplomacy cannot be a bandage after damage is done by policy. It has to be approached much like the solutions for the media. I've read a few things by Joseph Nye on this, and he argues there's three parts of public diplomacy that you need to pursue. One is the daily communications, right? This is important, although limited. It challenges the vacuum. It prevents the vacuum from being filled. It can control what is said, but not what is heard. And so therefore, the second step is more strategic communication, the ideas, the slogans that represent the big ideas that can be disseminated over weeks and months and years. This can include debunking, fact-checking. This could also include discrediting, targeting the messenger and not just the message. But really, the solution is the lasting relationships that can exist in things like exchange programs, training. This creates the civil society. This creates the networks of contacts that can overcome some disinformation because you have a level of understanding. You can overcome differences in culture. You can overcome the knee-jerk reaction, and you can overcome some of the moment of Twitter, the hot takes, if you will, by creating relationships that turn into government to government relationships, civil society to civil society relationships, and of course, journalist to journalist relationship. It is the same antidote, I believe, or the same solution going forward for journalism. Of course, we have to focus on the daily, the simple act of tweeting, because we have no choice, the simple act of putting out quick stories in order to inform the audience. But the equivalent for journalism of strategic communication is the idea that we need to be better and give something to our audience that no one else is giving. We cannot rely on the idea that the New York Times is trusted in order to keep the New York Times to be trusted. We have to continue to prove, we have to continue to get better and prove to our audience, viewers, listeners, watchers, that they can see something on PBS NewsHour, read something in the Times, or listen to something on NPR, or read it in the Atlantic, or listen to a podcast that is not provided anywhere else. So many eyeballs are out there. There is such a competition. The solution is not to blame YouTube or blame TikTok, it is simply to offer better content. And then lastly, the mirror of lasting relationships. Well, again, the same thing. The idea of creating in a younger generation interest in news, the belief that news can be informative and interesting and objective is something that is a generational battle for journalists, as it is the equivalent generational battle for diplomats today. And it is not something that we are winning, sadly, but it is something that we have to fight. And it is an existential threat. Let me end with an example of what I think kind of combines the idea of fighting for better journalism, fighting for better public diplomacy or diplomacy. And that is what I mentioned before, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, and in this case, Radio Free Asia. As we all know, Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty, first one, before they were combined, one pointed at Europe, obviously, the other pointed at the Soviet Union, now combined. Their utility was in their impartiality. The belief was, when it was created half a century ago, that propaganda could not be defeated with propaganda. It promoted democratic values simply by being free, simply by existing, simply by delivering what we all believe is an essential part of democracy, which is the free flowing of information and the ability to expose even ourselves. Fast forward to 2020. The outlet that exposed the largest detention in the world based on ethnicity since World War II was Radio Free Asia. Their Uyghur service was the first to report on what was happening to what we now know to be a network of labor camps, a network of detention camps that imprisoned more than 1 million Uyghurs. The Chinese call them re-education camps. The Uyghurs I spoke to describe scenes of beating, death, forced sterilization. But what exposed them was Radio Free Asia. Not because a political party in America wanted to target China, although it did happen at the time, but because we believed, the US believed, the West believed in the long-term benefit of an organization that was able to expose basic facts about a country whose government did not want those facts exposed. And those organizations still exist, despite attempts last year to destroy them. Radio Free Asia, Cuba, Middle East, all of these outlets continue to inform people in these countries about the United States and frankly about their own countries. And so I leave with this thought that while a lie can spread much faster than truth, while opinion can be much more popular than basic news, it is incumbent on us to realize that we will rise and fall together, and that only in doing our jobs better, whether as journalists or as diplomats, and specifically on public diplomacy, can we try to have a long-term effort to overcome these existential threats that challenge us thanks to disinformation, misinformation, and propaganda. So I'll leave it there, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Well, Nick, that was a fascinating and reflective presentation, for which I thank you. We've got a little bit of time for questions. I wanted to start with a focus on the news media itself. Tyson Reeder, in his introductory speech, talked about how the news media of the 19th century was admittedly ideological, and it was not presumed to be a question that journalists had a perspective. And then as we've gotten into the 20th century and somewhat into the 21st century, we came to adopt this idea that you have just spoken so eloquently to, the need for objective journalism. At the same time, though, there seems, as I understand it, to be some discussion going on within newsrooms and among journalists as to whether, in fact, they have this obligation to be objective, and whether, in fact, they should not return to the ideological practices of the 19th century. And I would say, without any scientific basis, but as I look at the New York Times or the Washington Post, I certainly see an enormous amount of what I would have called editorial opinion bleeding over into news coverage. And so I wondered if you could comment on whether this perception is correct and how vibrant this challenge is within journalism itself to maintaining the objectivity that I think you so correctly have said is essential to our long-term well-being.
The pressure to be opinionated, to be entertaining, which I would say in news, for better or worse goes, is one and the same, is a corporate pressure. It is not a grassroots pressure. It is not a perception among journalists of a certain age, certainly not older journalists, not journalists my age, and certainly not taught in journalism schools. It is a corporate pressure. It is a pressure built upon the success of the evening opinion programs on cable news, which make a lot of money because they have a lot of eyeballs, because they are entertaining and designed to persuade, not inform. And so I would not argue that the journalists themselves are questioning what you rightly point out is not a forever history by any means, but it is a history since the early 19th century of impartial, of objectivity. And so my challenge to my colleagues is that there is a way to be objective and yet also interesting and entertaining. A lot of people criticize Vice. I actually do the opposite. What Vice has shown is that there are young people who, by the millions, will watch hour-long documentaries about countries other than their own. And that is something that we should all remember. It is done in an interesting way. It's filmed beautifully often. It costs a lot of money. But, don't mistake it for anything. It is news about the world, and much of it is objective and lapped up. and it has made a lot of money. So I believe that, again, this may be naive, but if we were to do better, if we are okay with the fact that YouTube or TikTok are our competitors and realize that we need to engage through means that are unique and modern while maintaining our values. And I believe that argument can be made, but I admit that it's hard, and I admit that it's not cheap to do so. And unfortunately, the trends are going in the wrong direction there.
Thank you. We have a question in the chat about your view on foreign channels such as Al Jazeera or RT, Russia Today, Sputnik. Have you had to work with them, and how do they compare to the U.S. Voice of America?
So I used to work for Al Jazeera. I was Middle East correspondent for Al Jazeera America. And so that's my experience with Al Jazeera. I think it's important to contrast, let's say, Sputnik and RT. So let's take those. Again, and I had a long, as part of our series in Russia, we had a long conversation with Margarita Simeon, who's the very well-connected and very well-known editor-in-chief of Russia Today. And she makes arguments that on their face are completely legitimate and completely reflective of a genuine Russian frustration with the West, and a genuine frustration, frankly, that you hear even from all over parts of America and the West, which is that, the media groupthink led to the Iraq War. Okay, that's a completely legitimate argument. There's a lot of scholars in America who would argue that. But her point in doing that, again, is saying that you can't trust anything that comes out of the Western media. Her goal is not to make the Western media better. It is to make the Western media less relevant. And in so doing, she makes her content relevant. And do not be, nobody here would be persuaded otherwise. RT is an arm of the Kremlin. I mean, it would not do anything or say anything the Kremlin disagreed with. And yet, again, speaking of tactics and new media, RT created a mechanism whereby millions and millions and millions and millions of people see their stuff on YouTube, even though very few people are watching them on television. I'm talking about their English language stuff. And so, again, the arguments are not dissimilar to what people here would say, but their goal is to be more influential by taking people like me or PBS NewsHour or the networks down a notch, just as the Russian government tries to do, take the United States down a notch through, sowing discord, through trying to create divisions between Europe and the US. And so that is mirrored. So that is the difference between VOA and RT, that while VOA is paid for by the government, the US government, by the way, RFERL and what they call the grantees are a little different, but you asked about VOA. VOA is paid for by the government. But again, its power is in the proof that it can point to on its mission statement that it is independent. And I think most journalists want that to remain that way as an antidote to the kinds of disinformation spread by Sputnik and RT.
Thank you. This is very helpful. There's another question that you spoke in your remarks about Chinese disinformation effort. How effective are they compared to the Russians? And how much does that play into US-Chinese relations?
So I think the Russians have been doing it a lot longer. There have been studies by the CIA of Russian active measures since 1948, 47. I mean, and frankly, even decades and centuries before, there's versions of Russian active measures before the Cold War, of course. So the Russians and the Soviets before them have done it a lot longer. They have baked it into their foreign policy for a lot longer. And they are willing to do it at the very top. Sergei Lavrov will go to Germany and make a point, this is a few years ago, about immigration, about how dangerous Syrian immigrants are, based on a single anecdote that was fake. That was faked by Russian television in order to make Merkel less popular. And so they'll do it from the bottom to the top. The Chinese, we have not seen quite that level of coordination, the grassroots coordination, all the way to top diplomats spouting disinformation. But if we're going to separate disinformation from propaganda, what the Chinese have done, especially in the last 14 or so years, 15 years, as the CCP became more confident in its expansion and its ability to communicate. And then by 2012, as Xi Jinping took over with the blessing of the CCP to be more aggressive, what we now call wolf warrior diplomacy started even before that with Young Jae-chul, who used to be in Washington, the original wolf warrior diplomat 10 years ago, went to a speech and said, we are the big country, you're the small country, you're going to listen to us. And so they didn't use disinformation, they used coercion and propaganda. And most effectively, not necessarily in the United States, right? That really has been a Russian victory. It's in their backyard, because the first Chinese goal is to diminish US influence in Asia, what we now call the Indo-Pacific. And so if that is the first Chinese goal, where is it targeted? Think about the important choke points all across Southeast Asia. So the Malacca Strait in Malaysia, 3/4 of all oil that goes into China goes through there. Malaysia has been a particular target of disinformation and political coercion campaigns. Go down farther southeast, US allies, Philippines, right? Target of Chinese gray zone tactics with Chinese Navy, as well as economic and political coercion. And of course, what we all know with Taiwan, and then ongoing antipathy with Japan, especially. So what we see a little bit less of is this kind of proud active measures. They've tried a little bit of that. It is much more about coercion and influence. And then in COVID, they added what the Russians try and do, a little bit of sowing discord between the United States and Europe. And they did that by trying to sell PPE through Europe and trumpeting that and trying to highlight some of the Trump administration's mistakes.
A new question in the chat. We have a few minutes left. Especially when reporting from abroad. If a US journalist reports egregious behavior by one side of the issue, do they feel an obligation to report an equivalent, quote unquote, behavior by the other side to simply be viewed as balanced?
I remember talking to Rose Gottermiller. I'll do a diplomacy example and then back to journalism. Rose Gottermiller was the Undersecretary of State for ABC, I think, no, Assistant Secretary of State for ABC, right? Arms control. You guys remember what ABC
published a book, and she just won the Academy's Book Award this
Exactly.
year.
So Rose told me this great story of when New Start diplomacy started. And she was like, this is how the Russians do it, the first time. She goes in and she says, okay, well, you guys are doing XYZ with this missile that we think goes against this deal. To which Ryabkov, the deputy foreign minister, leans back in his chair and says, well, you know what? You know what you did to the Vietnamese in the 1970s, and proceeds to try and filibuster for 30 or 40 minutes, right? We call it whataboutism. Interesting question, but what about what you do? Now, does Russian whataboutism work? Well, as long as you have a couple hours, you can put up with the first 30 minutes, right? As journalists, we don't have a couple hours. I feel under no obligation, for example, to claim that a Uyghur 14-year-old in Kashgar spray painted something nasty about Han Chinese. Now, do I feel it necessary to portray the Chinese perspective, or at least what they say is their perspective? Of course. And part of that is pointing out that there is a Uyghur terrorist group, a designated terrorist group based of Uyghurs that have operated out of Chechnya and Afghanistan that have claimed attacks. I mean, this is like verifiable claims of attacks in Beijing, in Tiananmen Square, in the West, Tiananmen, I think, where a woman killed 10 people with a knife. So I will point out that there are Uyghurs who have attacked, who are terrorists. I will allow the Chinese government to have a soundbite or have their say on that, but I will not withhold. And more to the point, I won't, like if I have a 10-minute story, I'm not going to dedicate 5 minutes to that. I just want everyone to understand what the Chinese perspective is. But my story is about what's happening. And what is happening is, as I said, the largest detention based on ethnicity since World War II. And I'm going to show you that. And I'm hopefully going to deliver a level of understanding and empathy in order to do that. The more modern, the more recent example that I'll quickly relate is Ethiopia. So the Ethiopian government is starving Tigrayans to death as we speak. Every time I say that through a story, there is a mention of the fact that Tigrayan soldiers have crossed borders into another part of Ethiopia called Amhara and killed quite a few people. So of course I mentioned that. And I mentioned that the Tigrayan People's Liberation Front used to lead Ethiopia. But the argument of the whataboutism that I get through hundreds or thousands of Ethiopian trolls every time I say this out loud is just that. It's whataboutism. I am not going to withhold my description of what the Ethiopian federal government is doing because somebody else says the TPLF are terrorists, nor will I fear the Ethiopian government's wrath for doing so. But I will bend over backwards to make sure that you hear from an Ethiopian and you hear the argument that that government makes. But it does not have to be the scales of justice. That's not my job.
Thank you. David Pearce has clearly been continuing to be with us because he's posed a question for you. And he would like to know what you would see the government official diplomats do better than what are they not doing now, especially in terms of infotech and training. What can government officials do better at communicating and suppliers of info?
Yeah, so I'll go back to that structure that I laid out at the end, which, you know, as I said, Joe Nye essentially lays out. But you know, it has to be all three, right? So the first, you know, was the daily communications, and so, you know, with all due respect to many of my State Department colleagues who've had to do this around the world, they would be the first to say that they're slow, right? That they're slow on digital communications. They're slow because they don't have the resources or the assets. You know who does is the Department of Defense. And actually, if you watch their Twitter feeds, and slightly randomly, I'll give it, but even like when Tucker Carlson criticized the military or the Air Force for allowing women to become pilots and for designing a flight suit that would allow for pregnant women, Tucker Carlson had a long screed about how the military is becoming soft. The U.S. military services all jumped onto Twitter and actually put something out. So anyway, that's a digression. Clearly, the State Department needs to be better funded, better trained, and better equipped to deliver communications relatively quickly. But that really is only part of it. The only goal there is to prevent too many vacuums. You can, again, as I said, you can control what's said, but you cannot control what is heard. And so the strategic communications is that one extra step that is more important. And that is the combination of policy and public diplomacy, the ideas of our strategy, what they are, put them into a nice little box and disseminate them over days, weeks, months, years. That can include some debunking and fact checking and a little bit of discrediting if you get there, if you want to go a little bit more offensive. And again, the lasting relationships, right? That even greater step You know, I'm preaching to the choir, I know, in this crowd, but you know, soft diplomacy, you know, from Fulbright to U.S. libraries that every Pakistani who's 45 to 65 tell me that they used to love, that the U.S. canceled, as many of you will remember, you know, cultural exchanges, to military exchanges. You know, this is the first generation of Pakistani chiefs of army that we have starting a couple of years ago with the current one that did not train in the United States. First time, right? Because, you know, for those of you who worked on Pakistan will know, the Pressler Amendment, they ended up going to Saudi Arabia rather than the US, and you have true divergences of perspective. Of course, we've always had that, but it doesn't help. And so, you know, that third level, you know, again, you know, who am I? I'm a journalist, but those kinds of interchanges are long-term the most essential, in my opinion.
I think that's hugely correct. It seems to be a battle that we are regularly losing with the Congress, particularly on the educational fellowships. I remember when I first served in Yemen, virtually no minister spoke English. When I came back to Yemen some years later, as a State Department officer, Deputy Assistant Secretary, every technocratic minister was speaking English, and they were the graduate of U.S. universities. Those were exchange programs that the U.S. government had funded, and which we were now busily cutting off so that there would be no more. Now, of course, Yemen has descended into such chaos now that perhaps it doesn't matter. But there is, let's see, might have time for one more question. It says there are certain parts of the world covered more frequently and regularly, while others are almost not covered at all, despite important events happening there, e.g. protests in Colombia earlier this year, or back a year ago. The Nordost attack in Moscow was overshadowed by the DC sniper. Is that just a given, or is there anything journalists can do about this? Perhaps I should add, is that also simply a function of where American attention is?
On that last point, I am actually perhaps in the minority here. No, it is not about American interest or attention. It is about what editors think Americans are attentive to or care about. Let's call a spade here, right? There are editors who are making these decisions. But at its core, as I discussed at the top, this is a funding issue. So I will give you an example at ABC News where I used to work. There used to be two correspondents in Africa, one I think in Nairobi, one in Johannesburg. There used to be a whole Mexico City bureau. And there used to be, I'm just thinking about the Southern Hemisphere for a second. Not sure there was ever a Southeast Asia correspondent, but certainly a bureau in Delhi. Of course, not to even go into the number of bureaus that used to exist in Europe from Paris to Moscow. None of those, and one in Tokyo, none of them exist, literally none. The only bureau outside the United States for ABC News today is in London, and that also applies to all the networks. There are some individual employees, local and Western, in a few places around the world, but essentially everything is run out of London. And so when you look at the Southern Hemisphere, one, it's far from London, okay? Flying to Africa to do features, flying to South America to do features, or even to cover migration, which gets a little bit more coverage because of the political imperative of the border, is expensive, and it takes a long time. And US media simply don't have those funds anymore. But there are ways around this, again, and I've done very little touting of PBS NewsHour, but my boss, the foreign editor, Morgan Till, has created a network of freelancers around the world and works with, we've got to beg, borrow, and steal a little bit on public media here. And you will see a lot from parts of the world, or frankly, I'll do it myself, because guess what? We all help pay for the Associated Press and Reuters, and they are everywhere. And so we can use that and exploit that. Doesn't replace having people on the ground writing for years about a place, but at least it's a little bit of coverage. So what I would urge you all to do and think about is that, no, it is not a given that the United States media doesn't cover Africa or Latin America or Southeast Asia. It is only a product of fewer resources and the subjectivities of editors. And so again, if the media did a better job, this is a chicken and egg argument, if the media did a better job of covering those parts of the world, there would be more interest. And I think it is incumbent on all of us to try and do that.
Well, Nick, I want to really thank you. This has been an absolutely fascinating and sometimes provocative discussion, but it's also been a discussion of real reflection and depth. And I appreciate the obvious thought that you have put into both your prepared remarks and your responses to the questions. I really thank you for being with us on this program.
Thank you for having me, and thank you to all of you for participating.
Well, it's my responsibility now to almost close out. Andrew gets the last word. Am I unmuted? I was muted for a moment. I want to thank the Robert H. Smith International Center for Jefferson Studies, which has been our partner, as Andrew said, for 12 years of these programs. I want to thank the Virginia UVA and the Center and for Global Policy for joining with us. I want to give special thanks to Maria Rasaus, who is my able program manager at the Academy, and without whom I'm sure this would never get on the air, and to mention Whitney Pippin at Monticello as well. And I want to thank our speakers, Tyson Reeder, for a fascinating look back into foreign meddling in American press, our panelists, Glyn Davies, David Pearce, and Carol Giacomo, for a really interesting panel. And I think we've had a good day. I'm sorry we couldn't do it in person. It would have been lovely to be up on Mount Alto, taking a lunch break there, looking out over the valley, but maybe we'll get there next year. And with that, Andrew, over to you.
Well, thank you very much. You know, my first conference abroad that I held for Monticello was at the Salzburg Institute, which was founded after the Second World War by a group of idealistic Harvard students to explain America to Europe. It had some of America's foremost academics, members of the Supreme Court speaking there. It now hardly has any programs dealing with America. And I have to say, I rather regret the demise of such programs. I think it was a mistake that some of these programs were funded by the CIA, which made people think that somehow they were sinister, whereas the obvious place would have been the State Department or something similar to the British Academy that does programs. But hopefully we might see a resurgence of this soft diplomacy and explaining America to the rest of the world. I also thought that this was the most stimulating program. I'm very grateful to you, Ron, for continuing to work with us and to the Academy. I've always seen this as testimony to the professionalism of the ambassadors and their dedication to the national interest in volunteering their time. I thank again the University of Virginia Center for Politics and Damon Irby for adding many students to the audience, and of course the various staff, and especially to our speakers today. Thank you very much indeed, and we look forward to next year.
Thank you.